how many people in the room would kind of call themselves a marketer at either a startup or a smaller size company? Okay. And for the people that didn't raise their hands, are you in kind of larger corporates or large organizations or agencies? What's the kind of show of hands for that? Okay, there's a few people that don't know what they do, which is really interesting. Second question is, how many people are kind of would class themselves as working in tech or marketing tech products? Okay, that's good. The lens of the lens of the talk, which I'll get into in a second, bear with me, is through the kind of lens of being in a startup and marketing tech products. But hopefully there's something in there for everyone, and you hopefully might be able to take something away from it. But we'll see. You can tell me at the end if you did or not. So first slide is not a brag, and it's also not the failed script of my rom-com, which is 3 telcos, 2 not-for-profits, 2 startups, 1 IPO, and a collaborative workspace. That's just a summary of what I've been doing for the last 20 or so years. For the folks in Cambridge, you'll probably know me, if you do know me, from the Bradfield Centre, but that's a relatively new chapter in my career. I've actually been spending most of my career marketing and building product in startups and corporates, which is where a lot of this content comes from. And the slide, like I say, it isn't a brag, but it kind of is. So one of the startups I work for IPO'd. So I've kind of been very privileged to go through that classic unicorn story that we all hear told of for startups that start from very little and become billion-dollar companies and go public. So I am in the middle of that photo somewhere, standing outside the New York Stock Exchange back in June 2016. But that's just to reassure you that Joe just hasn't picked some random guy off the street to come and talk to you, but I have done some stuff. Right, so to the talk. It's really built around kind of 5 themes, and I'm not sure if it kind of hangs together, but again, you can tell me at the end. The first one is removing friction and complexity. And this is kind of your baseline, which is why it's 0. And obviously, the whole talk is about building a movement and anointing heroes, which hopefully will make sense as we go through. So really, I think sometimes, certainly in my experience, I think marketing can sometimes be pigeonholed around comms, advertising, PR, those kinds of things. In my mind, actually, marketing is vital across every part of the organization. And as marketers, we should be doing absolutely everything we can do to spot and remove getting your customer from discovering you, to using you, to spending money with you. And you should be obsessive about finding any barrier or any point of friction that might stop them achieving that goal. So really, you know, and certainly for the folks working in tech and startups, but this applies hopefully to anyone, is don't rely on your engineering teams to figure this out in the nicest possible way. So, you know, I think about the product design, I think about product discovery, product sign-up, first use, upgrading, downgrading. The first time you make a payment, taking money off people is always an emotional time. Customer service, all of these are really important things that marketers should be all over, because you really are the voice of the customer in the organization. But don't confuse removing complexity as removing functionality or the power. The key is about just removing friction and complexity. And to give you a couple examples of this, certainly in my Twilio days, we talked a lot about the mentality of people that build hardware versus the mentality of people that build software. So to give you 2 examples of this, how many people have got a TV remote control in their house that looks something like that? How many of you have pressed all the buttons and know what they do? 1 person, I salute you, sir. Because I don't know about you, but I think I'm quite technical, but I have no clue what most of those buttons do. And it tends to be button mashing to find out, and sometimes things happen, sometimes they don't. Contrast that to a remote control designed by a software company, which is the Apple TV remote control. I don't know if you've got Apple TVs, they haven't sold tons, but in terms of this kind of comparison, the software mentality is reduce the hardware down to the minimum possible specification. And you really only need 3 buttons, because all the power, all the functionality is in software, not the hardware. Another example, lovely credit card machines. So I still cannot tip correctly using these machines in restaurants, because it starts with the numbers and it doesn't feel intuitive. I don't know, it just never works for me. If you look at a software-driven business like Square, are you familiar with Square? Basically, you plug in that little white piece of plastic, which is not great contrast on this screen, into any existing device, and you suddenly have a fully featured credit card machine with an intuitive user interface that both the customer and the restaurateur can understand. Much better customer experience. And I think the most important thing about this is not just the user interface design and the perspective. It's the fact that the remote control for the TV and the credit card machine on the left, they can only do one thing. They never get any better from the minute they're manufactured to the minute you chuck them in the recycling bin. Whereas software-driven products get better every day when new software releases come through. And that's why by minimizing the functionality on the hardware, it frees you up to deliver continuous improvements to the customer, which is something as marketeers we should all be absolutely obsessed with. Okay, so first one, movements need causes. So it's unlikely that people are just going to use your product. You might be very lucky and you do find that situation happening, but let's assume that it doesn't happen, because that's certainly the majority of the situations. So you really need to think about what's your radical, why should people care about what you're doing. So if I just spend a little time talking about the experience with Twilio, has anyone heard of Twilio? Oh, okay, so that's better than I thought. But so Twilio is a very hardcore technology company, and I won't bore you with the details, but it's an API business, which basically means it's a software developer tool business. And when you boil it down, the actual thing that Twilio does is very boring, and it's very old. It's making software developers program the telephone network. So you can make telephones ring, you can send text messages, you can do chat sessions. But fundamentally, the technology is not new. So really, Twilio's rally call was really around the empowerment of the software developer as an actual audience of people. Because actually, for many years, especially software developers in corporates and larger organizations, they were quite an ignored and downtrodden group of people. Typically, they were seen as a resource that were just given projects to deliver, and they weren't empowered. So one of our key marketing insights was the empowerment of these people. So we really positioned Twilio as providing democratic access to the telephone networks for the first time. Because if anyone's worked in telecoms or has brought telecom services, it's controlled by big, large corporations and their gatekeepers. It's very opaque. It's effectively a black box. And if you're not an expert in telecoms, especially if you're a small business like a startup, it's very difficult to do business with telco companies. So really, we wanted to position Twilio as providing democratic access, a level playing field, and really allow you to program the telecoms network without any specialist knowledge, without having deep pockets, which is obviously important for a startup business. You can't sign up to very long, expensive contracts. You need to be able to have flexibility and experiment. And actually, most importantly, you didn't need permission from your boss or your procurement team to actually use the service. The historical way of buying software and IT products is you go through this horrible elongated RFP process. Your company decides that you're an official vendor. You get purchased, and then you have to go through your IT department to get service, right? That just doesn't work anymore. That's a completely antiquated way of working. And what you see is, over the last 10 years, is a lot of software firms have had great success making their product accessible to anyone through simple credit card purchases. So you've seen companies like Evernote, Dropbox, Trello. Are you familiar with these names? These are all tools and services that actually the individual users in a company start buying because they do what they need them to do, and they have lost the confidence and patience going to the traditional channel of talking to their procurement team to solve those problems. So we definitely locked on to that trend. And even today, 10 years down the line with Twilio, there's still that magical moment where a software developer can type a piece of code on a screen and their phone rings, because you're bridging the virtual world with the real hardware reality, and it is still a great thing to see. And like I say, the thing that's similar to Dropbox, Evernote, all these companies, is it creates this Trojan horse effect. Because what we actually saw in a lot of cases was the internal developers might be working on a passion project, or they might be hacking at a weekend. They prototype something that solves a problem for their business. And then effectively, the internal software team become your sales team because they're pitching it to their bosses saying, this is exactly what we need, yeah, and we need to deploy this in a commercial situation. So you do get that kind of real Trojan horse effect, and that became our rally call. You know, it's really much, so the marketing and the positioning of it was very much like, you know, we get you, we are you. You know, Twilio was founded and run by software developers. You know, we also hate antiquated systems and bureaucracy. And the real personal bugbear is that attitude of that elitism that you're too small for us to worry about. And really the attitude that I've always carried with me is you never know who you're talking to at any one point in time. You could be talking to the next billion-dollar company. You have no clue. So you need to make sure that you treat everyone equally and you give everyone an equal amount of both time and resources to develop their idea. So really, you know, you need to position yourselves as a positive wind of change. You need to create a sense of urgency and excitement for that change to happen. And you need to create the belief that users of your products and services are going to win, ultimately. But of course, it kind of all needs to be delivered with authenticity. That's really important, and we haven't got enough time to talk about authenticity. That's whole kind of talk in itself. But obviously, any claim that you make, you have to be able to back up. It has to be achievable, and it needs to be credible coming from your brand. So the other part of the title is anointing heroes. So every cause needs a hero. And what I mean by heroes is looking at your early users, your power users, your early adopters. Oh, thank you. You're very kind. So the key here, and kind of similar to what Harry was saying, really, in terms of influencer marketing, you know, recognizing your early adopters and enabling them to become advocates of what you're doing is really important. And that's certainly where we saw all of our growth come from. And from a marketing perspective, thank you, that's great. From a marketing perspective, telling real stories is always the way to go, back to that authenticity point. And obviously, the more creative those stories are, the better. Anyone remember Halo, the cab sharing service in London when that launched? Now taken over by My Taxi. But they were kind of, it was like an Uber experience, but for black cabs. They never talked about how many black cab rides they enabled from, say, Covent Garden to King's Cross, because that's kind of boring and no one cares. They always use an example of a woman getting a black cab from London to Lisbon on their app, because it's quirky, it's not what you expect, and there's that kind of story that draws you in. So the more quirky, the more interesting, the more creative uses that you see people using your product for. And the great thing about this is often people end up using your product for things you never dreamt they would do, right? So working in a tools business, you had that luxury of effectively Twilio made Lego building blocks. So we defined the brick, but we didn't define what you could build with them. So you're constantly being kind of surprised and delighted with what people come up with. So, for example, you know, a common use case for Twilio, because it's about communications, is building contact centers. But no one wants to talk about contact centers. It's the most boring thing in the world. But when you find someone like Lisa, who uses Twilio to light up clothing, it becomes really interesting. So Lisa runs a fashion brand in Berlin, and she's integrated Twilio into her clothing through conductive thread and LEDs, so you can text message her clothes, and they change, their lights come on, they change color and stuff like that. So it's just really creative, really inspiring. So at Twilio, we called our heroes doers, because we felt doers indicated someone that was actually proactive in terms of either building a company or building a product or software, right? Because we're talking, you know, to developers. And everyone always kind of loves and identifies with either an underdog or a real visionary, kind of upstart company that's kind of making a difference. So we're always looking for those kind of interesting use cases to case study. So, you know, think about, is there an opportunity for you to champion kind of neglected constituents with the things that you do, to try to build that kind of that movement and those heroes, and really kind of demonstrate your empathy and your understanding of that constituent. Obviously, it helps if you've got the same kinds of people in your organization, because that kind of really adds to the authenticity, and also helps you kind of identify their unmet needs. And obviously, that's the key to marketing, right? If you have unmet needs and you solve them, you're going to sell products. But of course, you know, it comes with a warning as well, because there's a fine line between building a movement and building a cult. So you don't want to have something that's too niche. And it's really important that all your messaging and your communication is not exclusive. It always has to be inclusive. So you can speak to a very targeted audience with a very specific message, but always be mindful not to exclude anyone else from participating. Because obviously you want everyone to have a positive experience with your brand. The next one, and there's only two more before I fall over. Sell the success of your users, not your product. Might sound a little bit counterintuitive, but it very much builds on the kind of theme of that last slide. So, your prospective customers, if they're shopping you online or talking to you at a conference, they want use cases, they want case studies, they want examples, they want inspiration, and people gravitate to success because anyone that's going to advocate your product to either their boss or their friends, they're putting their personal reputation on the line and maybe even their career. So they want to align themselves to success. So you have to reassure them that people that use your product have been successful, because that's ultimately going to kind of influence their decision in either direction. Spoken a little bit about what Twilio does, and I'm sure you're going to glaze over if I go into any more detail, but imagine selling a programming API to non-software developers. I'm sure you'd all walk off if I started to try and do that. But that's why we kind of found people like Dr. Max Little, who's a professor at Aston University. And he has just an inspirational use case of how he's used our technology in a way we would never have dreamt of ourselves. So what Max has done is he's working on the identification and treatment of Parkinson's disease. And he's developed an algorithm which allows you to sample a telephone call where someone speaks into the phone for 30 seconds. The algorithm detects vibrations in your vocal cords and can give a 98% accuracy if you're on the spectrum for Parkinson's disease. So this immediately removes the need to go to a clinic, take a £200 cost test, allows people to mass screen themselves. So this is potentially revolutionary stuff. And if you tell that story versus I stand here and talk to you about building a call center, you can see how the different take on the same product has a completely different impact on people. And obviously, by doing this, it's a real win-win situation because you create interesting content for your brand and an engagement opportunity with your audiences, but the people you feature also gain the marketing benefit of that as well because people always want PR for their company or their product. People, they might be seeking investment, and this kind of publicity tips them over to get that investment. If they're working in a corporate, recognition and success of their project might help them with career progression, and everyone always wants to go home and brag to mum and dad and friends and family, right? So if you appear in the press, it's good for everyone. So as marketers, to enable these kinds of stories, it is all about being on top of your metrics, on top of your audience, to spot these outliers with these really interesting use cases, and then focusing your effort on enablement and education, so content, tools, getting started, back to that early point about getting people through the gates as quickly as possible from kind of experimentation through to revenue. And of course, nurturing your community at all times. Most importantly, online and offline, don't discount the benefit of face-to-face contact when you're building your brands and your communities. Run meetup groups, go to meetup groups, build your conferences. That human interaction, especially when you're selling technology, it's all about human interaction and relationships, right? And most importantly, celebrate successes when you have them, because, like I say, people radiate success. And if you want people to endorse you, they need that confidence that they're not risking too much by endorsing you. They need those proof points. Build in complacency traps. So what I mean by this is these days, there are a few unique ideas still out there, but in the main, a lot of startups come from spotting an opportunity where an industry is controlled by incumbent players, and those incumbent players have become complacent, essentially. As companies grow, you become less customer-centric. The organization size builds in politics and inertia. And of course, it's easy to get hung on to legacy revenue streams, which kind of then is counterintuitive to investing in innovation, because you don't want to kill your cash cows. So, when you look at recent developments, good examples might be Airbnb versus hotels. It might be Uber versus taxis. I know Uber comes with a whole other set of baggage, but these are all startups that have grown from spotting incumbent industries which were slow-moving and not innovating. So, it is kind of human nature to get complacent when you do get success. So as your team grows, it's kind of inevitable, and again, this is more for the startup crowd, but also I think it applies. It's inevitable that as you grow your organization, you hire more people, those new hires are never going to be as emotionally attached to the idea as the founding team. That's just the nature of the game, right? So you should be always thinking about how do you spot and remove complacency everywhere around your business and ensure collaboration and teamwork across the cross-functional teams is always there, because that will kill you. So some examples of that could be Twilio's business model was a pay-as-you-go business model. So you pay per transaction. So if you make a phone call, you pay a little bit of money. If you send a text message, you pay a little bit of money. But the point being is there's no contract. So there's no sense of complacency, because someone can literally stop using you within 2 minutes of you pissing them off. So you're incentivized every day to come to work and do your best work, because you know your customers could leave you at any time. And that's quite different from the old way of selling IT. The old days, you know, for the folks that have been around a while, you'd have your guy from IBM show up, sell you a massive system with a 10-year contract, and probably 60% of the cost of service and support. And that's just dead in the water now, because the SaaS business models have completely ruined that business model for companies like that. Another example, and I'll mention the Bradfield Centre. I mean, it's not a Bradfield Centre pitch, but I've brought a couple of those things into the kind of mentality that we're doing at the Bradfield. And I see some faces here that are actually at the Bradfield, so hello. Number one is the longest lease that we ask you to commit to for an office at the Bradfield is 3 months. So we know if we piss any of our members off, they're going to leave us within 3 months. So again, that forces us to deliver a great experience every day. The other thing, we ask our members to rate us on Google. So if you go to Google, type in the Bradfield Centre, I think we're at something like 120 Google reviews in our first year. So we're kind of living or dying based on people's perception of what we do, not what we actually do, but people's perception of what we do. And that's a very transparent way to make sure that not only people that don't come to the Bradfield get a sense of what we're about, but also it's a great way for us to show. It's one of our key kind of customer satisfaction metrics. Obviously, we can talk about things like Net Promoter Scores, NPS, and stuff like that. But you know, Google ratings keeps us honest and make sure that we do a great job, or at least we strive to do a great job every time someone has an interaction with us. So one thing we do at my company, Central Working, who runs the Bradfield Centre, is everyone reviews new candidates when they're offered jobs. So we have an online platform. Everyone watches a video of the candidate, and everyone has a vote in the company. So there's a real sense of kind of empowerment and engagement that everyone is part of that process of selecting new people joining the business. If you have a large organization and you have an onboarding program where people come into the organization, get trained up on the culture, the kind of specifics, make sure you run those programs with mixed teams so people can form friendships across the organization within the first week of joining. Everyone should be answering support calls. You know, if you're selling stuff to customers, everyone in your organization should be talking to customers. Otherwise, how do you know what customers think about your products? Building on that, everyone in your company should know how to build with your product if you're selling something that makes other things. So again, even if you're not, even at Twilio, even if you weren't a software developer, you were expected to program an app with Twilio. If you couldn't code, you could get a buddy to help you code, but everyone went through that process, because otherwise, how have you got any empathy with what your customers experience on a day-to-day basis? And kind of similar to the support call, similar to using the product, everyone in your company should be able to sell the product, regardless of who they are, because everyone is going to have an interaction with a customer at some point in their day-to-day working, or even in their personal lives. So everyone should be able to pitch your company and what you do and what your product does. And I kind of touched on the kind of arrogance of the kind of larger companies that creeps in. Again, just treat everyone as your next potential multi-million-pound customer, because you have no idea. If you could pick them, then you'd all be billionaire VCs. And I'm assuming most of us aren't billionaire VCs in the room. And then finally, I'll go really quick, just on this last one. Obsess or go home. I love this guy. This is fantastic. Any Star Wars fans in the room? He kind of likes Darth Vader, I'm getting the idea. So, you know, the point with this slide, right, is I have had a bit of an insight into what it's like working in Silicon Valley in a high-growth company. And if you're not all in on this journey and you're not spending all of your time obsessing about making your company and your product better, you should really stop, because there's people out there that are absolutely doing that. And it's very likely they're going to be doing something in your space as well. So there is no scope for any complacency in anything you do. don't let anyone outwork you. You know, you should be working as much, of course there's a work-life balance, and of course, you know, mental well-being and stress and all those kinds of things are super important. But within reason, don't let anyone outwork you. You should be working to the bone to make your company successful. Because I've seen that energy, that focus, that drive that other people have got. There's a reason why companies are successful from Silicon Valley. It's not just access to capital. So you've got to bring your A game every day, and that's why building in those kind of traps to catch that complacency creeping in are kind of really important. And, you know, success, whatever you define personally success as, it just doesn't fall in your lap. Successful people are successful for a reason. So I think I've waffled on for enough. You can chat to me, obviously, afterwards, or I'll take some questions. You can get the slides from that URL and come and hang out at the Bradfield Centre.